Okay, well, welcome to CEAS. My name is Dr. Christian Emery. I'm a lecturer in international politics here. Absolutely delighted to welcome Sir Laurie Bristow tonight to speak about his extraordinary book, Kabul, Final Call, which details his day-to-day experiences as the last UK ambassador to Afghanistan and the final evacuation of Kabul. I think it's fair to say that Laurie was charged with one of the most difficult diplomatic missions in the history of UK diplomatic services. And this alone would make that account a really vital contribution to the historical record. But the book is not just a first-hand account of those sort of horrifying final days of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and that kind of heart-wrenching evacuation of Kabul. It actually makes a really important and vital contribution to, and I hope widely digested contribution to our understanding of how and why that 20-year political and military campaign in Afghanistan ended so chaotically. And as public attention sort of starts to shift away from Afghanistan, it's a book that issues a powerful message that we cannot and must not avoid the hard questions about how it all came to this. And Laurie goes a long way to providing some important answers to those questions. So there are really few better placed to tell that story. Laurie was the last UK ambassador to Afghanistan during the fall of the Republic to the Taliban in 2021. And of particular interest to CEAS students, Laurie was the UK's ambassador to Russia from 2016 to 20, and to Azerbaijan from 2004 to 2007. And he held senior roles in London, including Director of Eastern Europe and Central Asia and Director for National Security. So this is by any measure a distinguished and varied career, and we're very lucky to have Laurie here today. The format for today's talk is that Laurie's going to introduce his book for about 10 minutes to set the scene. Then we will have a short slideshow presented by Jimmy Langham. Jimmy was the leader of the military comms team that was tasked with photo documenting Operation Pitting. Laurie and I will then be in conversation for, about 30 minutes to see how it goes. And that should leave plenty of time for Laurie to answer your questions. Now, the discussion is, of course, primarily about Afghanistan, but we are at CEAS, and Laurie has kindly agreed to range a bit wider and to draw upon his considerable expertise on Russia, not least as former UK ambassador. So really do we can take the discussion wherever we think is appropriate. Final bit of housekeeping. Tonight's event will be recorded and it will be posted on UCL's YouTube account. So please be aware of that when you're asking a question. And the obvious one, please, at a bare minimum, make sure that your mobile phones are set to silent. So, without further ado, please welcome Sir Laurie Bristow.
Thanks, Christian. Thanks, everyone, for taking the time this evening to come and discuss what we'll be talking about this evening. Can I first just check, is the mic working okay? Mic's not out. Is that any better if I move it up?
Yes.
Right, okay. Basic stuff. So, look, as Christian said, what I'll do first of all is just talk for maybe 10 minutes or so about the book itself and say a few things about what it talks about. So, the first most important question was why write this? When I got back from Afghanistan in late August 2021, an old friend, some of you might have known him, Iraj Bagazadeh, the founder of IB Taurus, contacted me and said, can I have first refusal on the book? To which my answer was, yes, you can, but I'm not going to write it. Essentially what Iraj then did over the following months was work at me and explain why it was necessary to write it, even if I just put it in the cupboard at the end of it and be done with it. And of course, his point was that there is almost nobody else who can write this story in terms of having been there during Operation Pitting, but also dealing with the senior government figures in Afghanistan in the final months of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, advising and implementing the UK's policy and developing it through that period, but also, of course, dealing with our international partners and allies in Afghanistan as frankly, things fell apart in the final months. If you've read it, you will have worked out that it was not easy to write, and it is not meant to be easy to read. I wrote it, though, because what happened in Afghanistan in August 2021 was a huge failure of policy and strategy, but it was also a huge human tragedy. This book is about real people. We need to understand what happened and why, otherwise we will not learn from it. So the starting point, I think, even with this audience, is to go back to 2001 and just remember why international forces, the UK, the Americans, went into Afghanistan in the first place. It was to suppress the threat from Al-Qaeda after the 9/11 attacks. We needed to suppress the threat to the West, to the US, the UK and our allies from Al-Qaeda after the attacks on 9/11 in the United States. To achieve that, it was felt necessary to remove Al-Qaeda's Taliban hosts. Once you've done that, what happens next is, of course, a process of trying to create an Afghan state, preferably an Afghan-led process. And the state, of course, needed to achieve a number of things. One is, of course, top of the list, that it would never again host Al-Qaeda or other international terrorist groups. But over time, the mission evolved. In addition to the counter-terrorism mission, there was a counterinsurgency mission, basically suppressing the threat to that state and to our forces from a resurgent Taliban and others. Counter-narcotics, this country was the largest source in the world for many years of heroin. State building in a country where there was never a state in a form that we at least recognized as a state. Development. This is one of the poorest countries in the world, one of the least developed countries in the world. It still is. In some ways, it's got a whole lot worse in the last 2.5 years. And of course, values, foremost among them, gender equality and the effects of the absence of gender equality. Achieving all that needed an enormous military commitment from the US and its allies to support the Afghan state against the Taliban insurgency. So just to remind those who don't follow this in detail, at the height of the Western military intervention, there were in excess of 130,000 US and other allied troops in Afghanistan. So the Obama surge announced in 2009. Of course, Obama's initial intention was to bring those troop levels down. But the military advice was that in order to create the conditions to do that, first you need to surge. Now, the other thing going on, while this was happening, of course, the US led an invasion of Iraq in 2003. I worked on the planning for the post-conflict phase of that invasion. I don't think it will come as a surprise to anyone in this room that it was a catastrophe. But it was also a huge diversion of resources, of military force, of money, of political attention, and of course of political credibility as that enterprise unfolded. But of course, domestically, both conflicts came to be seen as quagmires. Expensive, risky, unproductive, electorally unpopular legacy wars. So the decision was taken to end NATO combat operations by 2014. But simply withdrawing NATO's combat troops was never going to create the conditions for lasting peace. What was supposed to happen after 2014 was a decade where the focus was on building Afghan institutions, including Afghanistan's armed forces, supported by a NATO train and equip mission, what became Resolute Support Mission. Resolute Support was the NATO presence that was being wound up as I was preparing to go out to Kabul in 2021. So the book itself starts with the decision to do that, to wind up that mission. It was a decision taken by the Donald Trump presidency, and it was formulated in an agreement between the US administration and the Taliban, not the government of Afghanistan. They weren't party to the agreement, in February 2020. So the Doha Agreement. In that agreement, the US set out its intention to withdraw all foreign military forces, the whole lot, within 14 months. The Taliban agreed to begin talks with the government of Afghanistan about a political settlement. But the military withdrawal was not made conditional on them either engaging, still less actually agreeing a political settlement. So what did they do? Not unnaturally, the Taliban slow-rolled the intra-Afghan negotiations and at the same time launched a full-blown military campaign to seize control of Afghanistan. President Biden then became president, elections at the end of 2020, transition at the beginning of 2021, right in the middle of the military withdrawal. Biden, of course, had long been opposed to the military presence, and you might remember that after a very short review, a couple of months, finished in the middle of April, the Biden administration decided to press ahead with the military withdrawal on a slightly slower timetable. And that withdrawal was largely completed by the weekend of the 4th of July holiday. That was the weekend that the Americans basically walked out of Bagram Air Base. I think, though, that the wider political context is important here, because as everyone will remember, the start of the Biden presidency was marred by the refusal of Donald Trump and his supporters to accept that he'd lost the election. That then led to the assault on the Capitol. In my view, if Biden had not pressed ahead with the withdrawal of the military forces from Afghanistan, whether or not he wanted to, he would have been wide open to political attack from Trump for squandering the pathway to ending the US's longest war. Taliban, meanwhile, intensified their military action. They seized control of the main roads, they seized control of the border crossings. In the period after the Doha Agreement, by the UN's count, they assassinated over 700 Afghan politicians, journalists, and public figures. They neutralized the Afghan Air Force, not by shooting down the planes, but by visiting the homes of the Afghan pilots and killing them. They conducted a highly effective propaganda campaign, essentially using YouTube to invite Afghan soldiers to surrender and posting grisly videos of what would happen to them if they didn't. They launched a rocket attack on the government on the morning of Eid. Those rockets passed over my embassy. A slightly different pattern of the rockets landing, they would have killed most or all of the government. My direction from London was to keep the embassy open once the military had left. So for many years, this had been one of the UK's biggest embassies in the world. For some years, it was the biggest embassy in the world, and was described by the government as our top foreign policy priority. The task, of course, even once the military had left, was what it had been for the previous 20 years since 9/11, to work with the government of Afghanistan to suppress the threat from Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, and to support that, in support of that, to maintain Afghanistan's political stability, its economic development, address its humanitarian needs, and its alignment with our values, in particular those rights of women and girls, in one of the world's poorest and most conflict-ridden countries. The problem was that all of this had been underwritten for 20 years by the military presence which would be gone by the summer of 2021. So what I was doing in the months leading up to travelling out to Afghanistan in June was leading a task force in London, essentially re-engineering our entire presence there for a world of no military support. I arrived in mid-June. Even as the military withdrawal was still taking place, Afghanistan's armed forces were collapsing. The end came very suddenly. Lisa sitting at the back, I think, was there reporting on it as it was happening. To give you an idea of the speed of that collapse, as I said earlier, the Taliban had been progressively seizing control of the country, but not the main towns. The first of the main towns to fall to the Taliban happened while I was in the air on a plane for a short trip back to London. It was Zalanj on the Iranian border. 9 days later, Kabul fell. So Kabul fell on the 15th of August. Things moved incredibly quickly. Efforts were still underway to negotiate an interim power sharing agreement with the Taliban, which fell through when President Ghani fled the country on the 15th of August. We were tracking this through the day, watching the helicopters line up, watching the efforts to get together some sort of soft landing. Then all of a sudden, in my WhatsApp group, popped up a message saying Ghani's gone. He'd appeared that morning on the television, broadcasting a message to the nation, pulling levers of power that were not by then attached to anything at all. And by the afternoon, the Taliban were photographing themselves behind his desk. We'd taken the decision that we had to close and evacuate the embassy a few days before. The plan was to relocate a small team of diplomats to the embassy, to the military base that we maintained on the airfield, and from there to organise the evacuation of British nationals and Afghans most at risk. While this was happening, a decision was taken in Washington and London and a few other capitals that we needed very, very quickly to pull back in the military forces we just pulled out in order to enable that evacuation. That deployment was in progress but not complete when Afghanistan fell to the Taliban. That becomes quite important for something I'll come to in a minute. On the 14th of August, the senior US military commander in Afghanistan warned that the Taliban could attack Kabul within the next 24 to 48 hours. And that if they mounted an attack, particularly on the airport, we did not yet have enough soldiers in place to defend it. You'll remember that the Taliban's intentions were unknown. They'd fought their way to power, they'd overthrown the government of Afghanistan, despite all the commitments made in the Doha Agreement to negotiate. Thousands of Taliban prisoners had been let out of prisons as they were overrun. Large numbers of Islamic State prisoners had also been let out of those prisoners. You all saw what happened next. The airport was overrun, we lost control of the airfield and of the runway. There were thousands of people, desperate people, wanting to get out. Aircraft were being mobbed, people were clinging onto the sides. For 24 hours, everything hung in the balance. Only once the military had regained control of the runway were we able to get enough soldiers in to secure the airport to start getting people out. Once that was achieved, Operation Pitting began. So in under 2 weeks, the UK got out over 15,000 people. It was far more than we thought possible, at least 3 times as many as we thought possible. But it was, we did not finish the job. There was no way we were ever going to finish that job. I won't even begin to describe the conditions in the airport. You'll see some of them. That evacuation was only possible because of an uneasy truce with the Taliban. Those are the men with guns who we had fought for over 20 years. As the evacuation was coming to an end, we were starting to see signs of a terrorist attack being planned against the evacuation. And on the 26th of August, it happened. So again, I remember very, very vividly the WhatsApp messages popping up. The attack is imminent, and then the attack has happened. An Islamic State suicide bomber attacked the Abbey Gate, which was one of the gates where the US were conducting their evacuation from, very close to the entrance to the Baron Hotel, the place from which we were conducting our evacuation. At least 170 Afghans and 13 US servicemen and women were killed in the very last days of that campaign. So to finish up, before we go into a discussion, why did all this happen? It was obviously the failure of the inescapable failure of a 20-year campaign. That didn't happen for want of resources. Depending on what you count, the US and its allies put something like $2 trillion into the Afghan campaign. But there is an argument to say we would have done better simply throwing bales of money out of the backs of planes. We created a state, we created a military that were completely dependent on us. They quickly collapsed when the US and allied military left. We, the US, the UK, and others, did not invest early enough in an inclusive political settlement that would have created the conditions for our military to leave. Of course, how you'd have got there, what that settlement would have looked like, that's obviously for debate, but we hadn't created those conditions. In my view, what happened in Afghanistan also demonstrates very clearly some other rather important things. At heart, the problems there were political and societal. There are problems that you can fix or where you need to apply a military force to create the conditions to fix them, but you cannot cure political and societal problems by military means. If you try, you might well make them worse. Trump's Doha deal. I've said it before and I will say it again. In my view, this was probably the worst deal in history, if it's understood as a means to try to solve the Afghan conundrum. It set a timetable for the military to leave. It did not set binding conditions on the other party to the agreement. In doing so, it also did something else. It removed any incentive on the Taliban to negotiate a political settlement, and at the same time, it pulled the rug out from under the Afghan government and armed forces. And that's why we saw what we saw in August 2021. Jimmy.
Thanks. Guys, good evening. And again, thank you all for coming. So just as a brief introduction, I'm Jimmy, and I was head of the crisis comms team and one of the co-authors of some of the content that you're about to see. I'm still serving Royal Air Force officer, and quite a lot of people are surprised that the military is sending crisis comms teams to places like Afghanistan and other areas that were deployed. But in a day and age where disinformation is one of the global threats, we realise that we have to fight to control the narrative just as much as we have to fight, if not more than we do, to control the battlefield. And we had two large issues with this. One, which was quite ironic, is that we've just been defeated by a largely illiterate organisation, the Taliban, who were outstanding at messaging. And there are some theories that actually we never lost a battle, but we were out-messaged. Secondly, when you're proposing to bring a large unknown number of refugees to the United Kingdom, it is still, can't be disputed, a very contentious issue within UK politics. And it was our duty to ensure that we could try and convince people the best we could that this was a good thing to do. So how do we do that? Well, we did that by telling stories. And looking back at the time, we weren't quite sure what stories were going to gain traction. As Laurie said, the Taliban had taken over far faster than anyone forecast. And as a result, a lot of global journalists couldn't get in. So there was this insatiable appetite for content, which my colleague and I were sending out. But we did begin to notice that the stories that were getting more traction than anything else were the stories of Afghan women. And when I look back and I reflect on my time there in Afghanistan and the evacuation, the first thought that comes to my mind was the courage of Afghan women. I'll just illustrate this quickly through two stories. One was a Hazara family, and if you're not familiar with the ethnic makeup of Afghanistan, they were oppressed for quite a while. They just come through to the evacuation process. We were going to get them out, but it was a very difficult process to get through. It took days and days, and without going into detail, there was a lot of brutality happening in the queues. And this family volunteered to speak to us, but their mother and father were incredibly shaken. And the 9-year-old girl who was covered in bruises on her arms, she'd been beaten by the Taliban, stood up and said, "Look, I'm not scared. I'll go on camera now." And secondly, towards the end of the evacuation, we were all incredibly fatigued. We were going for days without sleep, without food. I'd fallen asleep in a chair by the evacuation centre. And this Afghan guy woke me up and said, "Excuse me, I'm sorry to disturb you, but my daughter wants to ask you a question." Clearly, I was fatigued, but I couldn't say no. And his daughter was about 10. She was incredibly sheepish. And she came up to me and said, "Can I just ask you, when I get to the United Kingdom, can I be a doctor?" I said, "Of course you can. You can be anything you want to be in the UK." And she said, "If I stay here, I can't do that anymore, can I?" That really demonstrated why we were doing what we were doing. And thankfully, we had a 15% increase in support for the evacuation towards the end. So we'll just take a look at some of the imagery now, guys. If you don't mind, we're going to do a slideshow. It won't be up for long. The imagery speaks for itself, but it will remind us of the things that we've done, the things that we allowed other people to do, and the things that should never happen again.
Thank you.
Tag team with this
Perhaps. Thank you so much, Jimmy, for that. I mean, those images really, you can tell the impact they've had on the room, and they really set the scene in terms of the sort of just how moving and striking they are. Along with, thank you so much for sort of setting the scene of your book as well. Really, kind of to lead on to that, I want to first sort of start by thinking about your preparations for this absolutely extraordinary mission, keeping open a very large and complex embassy without the protection of US or NATO forces. And I think you were appointed to the ambassadorship 6-8 months before you actually arrived, and you spend this time diligently scenario planning. And you mentioned that not even the most pessimistic analysis predicted the collapse of the Afghan Republic within 12 weeks of you landing. I just wondered, what was the most pessimistic analysis? And also, can you just talk us through those first few days of your impressions of the country? And did you sort of get this sense that it was recognisable to what you had planned for?
Thank you. So, first of all, maybe take them in order, the planning process. So when you're appointed to an ambassadorial job, at least in the UK, ideally you want a good lead-in time, because you've got to, even if you know the subject matter, even if you know the country, it's quite important to go out knowing where things are at, but also having made your presence felt with the seniors back in London. So the senior officials, the ministers, in this case, of course, the military and others who were so heavily invested in what we were trying to do there. The planning process, though, for this particular job was entirely driven by the fact that by the time I arrived, we would be midway through a withdrawal of all of those military forces. And of course, what that meant was the first question you ask is, can we actually do this? Can we actually run an embassy on that size, or actually any size, in an environment in the middle of a war zone where we don't actually have that military underpinning? So maybe to describe a bit more the scene in Kabul. The center of the city was a city within a city. It's called the Green Zone, similar to Baghdad, completely walled off from the rest of Kabul and from the rest of the country, with very large numbers of Afghan forces and a rather smaller number of US, UK and other international forces whose job is to keep that zone secure. In it, you've got the major embassies, you've got most of the government, you've got the defense ministry, you've got the presidential palace. If you can't keep those places secure, nobody has any business being there. And in terms of your legal and ethical duty of care to staff, you can't keep people there. I mean, that's the basic rule of these things. So a lot of the planning was what capabilities we would need to be in place before the military withdrew. How are you going to run the physical guarding of it? What happens if there's a big attack? Who do you call? Who is the rapid reaction force? Right down to really basic mundane stuff. What if somebody gets shot or blown up? Who is providing the medical facilities if the medical facilities run by the military, our military, are not there? The answer was the Norwegians, by the way. They had a thing out at the airport. Very, very good. But it's even more mundane than that. So you've got an embassy, in our case, of about 500 people by the time I arrived, a mixture of UK nationals, Afghans and third country staff, very heavily skewed towards guard force and life support. Ask this question. In a city where there are no functioning public services, how do you keep the lights on? How do you keep the water flowing? And what happens when the sewage tanks fill up? So one of the parameters for us, I had an elaborate grid of what are called indicators and warnings, things that tell you now is the time to leave. And at the top of that list is, we can no longer guarantee the security of the Green Zone or the embassy. At the bottom of the list, you know exactly how many days water supply you've got, and you know exactly how many days it takes for the sewage tanks to fill up. And if you can't empty them, you're leaving. Think about it. It's not as if you can check into a hotel. The Taliban have formed blowing up the hotels and strafing them. So in addition to that, the two other elements of the planning were, if things go bad, how are we getting out of here? What are the triggers for that decision? It's a very, very big decision to pull that embassy out, partly because of why we're there, partly because of the impact on our alliance with the Americans, and partly because in doing so, we might actually bring the whole thing down. We're the second biggest embassy in Kabul. If we leave, not only do a lot of other embassies say, right, we need to as well, but actually we're taking out our control of a substantial part of the defences of the Green Zone. And that's actually what happened in the final few days. So moving on, arriving there. I had a pretty good idea, or pretty good sense going out that it would be, the embassy would be closing on my watch. I really didn't see how it could be sustained over any period of time. Within that, though, you've got a very wide range of scenarios, through to we struggle on somehow and things deteriorate gradually, through to catastrophic failure, essentially what we got. But it's really hard to predict where things will come on that spectrum. It's quite hard to predict when they will come as well. In the book, I publish a series of the reporting telegrams that we sent back from Kabul, basically charting the accelerating collapse, the cascading collapse of the military and the government. In terms of what the job actually involved, I think there are really about three things to focus on. One is getting to know the decision makers in the country you're in. This is what an ambassador does. What that looked like was a very rapid series of face-to-face meetings with everyone from the president downwards. You've got to get the trust of these people in a matter of days, because that may be the timescale in which quite big decisions are being taken and quite important messages being passed. You also need to give clear and well-founded advice back to your government in London. Since leaving government service, one of the things I've reflected on a lot and talked a lot about is the importance of telling things as they are, not as you would like them to be. I think it's about the most important thing that any senior official ever does. It's really easy to tell people what they want to hear. It's a lot harder to tell them what they need to hear. Last point is leading your staff. So bear in mind that for the UK-based staff, they're all volunteers. They can leave any day they want. For the Afghan staff, it's their country. They can't leave unless we evacuate them. And last point, we're doing all this under COVID lockdown conditions, which considerably complicated everything.
Thank you so much. Your book reflects a lot on the obvious flaws of the Doha Agreement. And you're pretty clear that this was ultimately a plan for US withdrawal dictated by the needs of the US electoral cycle rather than any kind of viable long-term political settlement for Afghanistan. I guess the question is, by this point, could the Trump or the Biden administration or any other administration impose conditions on the Taliban without an open-ended military commitment? And I guess in that sense, was there an alternative to this brutal ripping off of the plaster? And, for example, should the US have insisted that US troops stay until the Taliban at least formally commit and actually participate in power sharing? Or should the US and UK just have been much more honest about the obviously awful consequences of the military withdrawal?
Thank you. There are some really, really good questions in there, which I think we'll all be struggling with for many years, and some obvious counterfactuals as well. But I would just say, before launching into my own views on this, is that there are a couple of people in the room whose involvement with Afghanistan goes back way longer than mine. But anyway, I'll go at answering the question. I think there are really two central parts to this question. So first of all, how do you get to a political settlement, or within sight of a political settlement? I'm tempted to say, well, you don't start from where we started from. If after 19 years your public is tired, they can't see the benefit of the investment, the loss of life. Remember that it's not just money. For the UK, this is 457 dead British soldiers over that timescale. A much larger number for the Americans and an unaccountably larger number for the Afghans themselves. Unless you're prepared to keep this up indefinitely, you need a good answer, you need a good path to a political settlement. We never had one. My personal view is that to get a better chance of achieving one, you need to go back a lot further, many, many years further back, start in a different place, and maybe bear in mind, some of the basic rules of negotiation. First of all, understand what you want. I don't think we were ever crystal clear about that, or at least not all at the same time. Second, understand what your opponent wants and what they're prepared to trade to get it. Third, negotiate when you're in a position of strength and the other side are in a position of weakness, not the other way round. And putting yourself under time pressure is a pretty weak position, which is essentially what the Doha deal did. Second point is, could this collapse have been arrested? So the military advice from the top US soldiers, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the head of CENTCOM, the military command that had oversight of the Afghan campaign, have gone on the record saying that their advice to the presidents, both presidents, was press pause. You don't press pause simply because you can't think what to do. You press pause to create a different set of circumstances. And those different set of circumstances should have been to change the incentives on the Taliban. Broadly speaking, to say to them, you are not going to get what you want for nothing. You're not going to get it simply by waiting us out. You have to negotiate. That's in the deal. You said you would do it. And you have to compromise. You have to achieve some form of power sharing. It would have been extremely messy. There's nothing about this ever that wasn't. And it would have been a lot riskier. To take that decision, you need to be prepared, if necessary, to enforce it, and if necessary, to take casualties to do it. But I don't actually see any alternative scenario other than saying, okay, well, we're out of here. That's the plan. That's the agreement, and accepting the consequences. And to speak to your last point, being honest with yourself that those are the consequences.
Thank you. I mean, understandably, your book is primarily concerned with the end of this 20-year Western commitment, although you have reflected on the deeper sort of origins of failure here. I wonder if we could investigate that a little bit and go back to that 2002 moment where the Taliban has been comprehensively defeated. There's a bit of a debate about how that war turned into a nation-building project in itself, when it seemed at that point the Bush administration had little interest in that and saw Iraq as the big ideological nation-building project, and this was more of a security operation. And I wonder what you make of Theo Farrell's argument that it was actually the Europeans, and particularly Tony Blair, who was driving this sort of nation building and all this sort of social engineering that it entailed. The idea being the war in Iraq had exposed this rift within NATO, within the transatlantic alliance, and the European leaders saw participating NATO involvement in Afghanistan was a way of healing this rift and sort of carving out a new role for NATO. And it was actually a sort of a European sort of project rather than an American nation building project.
So those who were around at the time dealing with this stuff at the time will remember that it was a pretty fraught period in transatlantic relations, particularly around the decision to launch the military operation in Iraq and then the consequences of the operation. Theo Farrell's writing on this. I mean, if you want only one book to read from a UK perspective on this, I would go for Unwinnable. That is the title of Theo Farrell's book on the UK involvement in Helmand. Essentially, his proposition was that the UK, for reasons that those involved in the decision can explain for themselves, took on a military operation that we simply could not win. We were not capable of winning, and it wasn't even clear what winning would look like, to be frank. Well, there is a lot of ideology, a lot of making sense of things after the event in all of this. But to bring it back to the what happened in 2021, I think the way I would summarize it as that we were never entirely clear about not only what were we trying to achieve, but how the big pieces of that fitted together. What depended on what, and what was necessary to achieve that outcome. So maybe at this point, just share an anecdote, which is in the book, a discussion I had with a senior Russian diplomat some years ago in Moscow. I mean, there's plenty I could say about that Russian diplomat, including his own role in some of these things. But for the purposes of this, I asked him, he was still is, Russia's Afghanistan director. I asked him, what does Russia actually want us to do here? An unreasonable question in the circumstances. And his answer was, don't fail and don't stay. And I still can't improve on that. It's a pretty good strategic summary of what that campaign really was about. We did not want to own Afghanistan in perpetuity with all the costs and risks and awfulness that entailed. But we couldn't leave in a way that allowed the enterprise to fail, yet somehow we did. My other point, again, another Russian anecdote in the book. It must have been about 2008 or 2009. I took a parliamentary delegation from London to see General Gromov. General Gromov at that time was a member of the State Duma, the parliament. He, of course, was the commander of the Soviet 40th Army, the last man out across the Amudarya Bridge, the Friendship Bridge, when the Soviets withdrew. He came to the meeting in full uniform, big hat, a whole lot. He has the kind of voice that it takes a lifetime of drinking and smoking to achieve. He, in some ways, is a very, very astute commentator. He basically growled his way through the full list of the mistakes that the Soviet Union had made in Moscow, in Afghanistan. Then he paused for breath, and then he listed out mistakes. And he wasn't wrong.
Thank you. I want to think a little bit about the Taliban and how hard the Taliban is actually to analyse as an actor, as a unit of analysis. It's so split by age, ethnicity. You've got the Haqqani network. You've got the leadership in Doha, or the clerical leadership in Kandahar. You've got all these different schisms. How difficult did that make it at the time to analyse the Taliban, and how difficult does it make it for the UK and others to chart a strategy for dealing with them now? I mean, I work on Iran, and I'm minded that after the Iranian Revolution, there was sort of this expectation that hardline parents could never run a modern country, and eventually some more pragmatic, technocratic element would come and we could do business with them, and we're still waiting. But if you could sort of think about how we actually analyse and understand the Taliban itself.
So I'm going to answer the question from the viewpoint of a practitioner rather than an analyst or an expert on the Taliban. There are other people doubtless in the room better qualified to talk about the innermost workings of the Taliban. So a couple of things to think about there. One, of course, is the non-unified nature of the Taliban themselves. One of the things I think we've been discovering before and after August 2021. So who are you talking about? Which Taliban? You're talking about the clerics, you're talking about the political commission in Doha, you're talking about other power centers. You need to be really clear, actually. You need to understand and be able to map who is the actual decision maker in all of that. So if you take, for example, the decision on girls going to school. The day before term starts, girls are going to school. The day of term starting, girls are not going to school. Clearly something had happened there, and it's not hard to work out what. I think it's now well documented. For us at the time, though, there's also a rather starker version of this. So the talk when I arrived, when I was preparing to go, was of the Taliban Mark II, Taliban 2.0. I never saw the slightest shred of evidence to suggest that the Taliban's views on the world had changed during their time out of power. We were busy telling ourselves, including some quite senior people, that was the case. That when they came into office, they'd learned from their time in exile things would be different. I think we're seeing what actually happened there. But in a way, there's an even bigger error, I think, that was being made, certainly in some of the conversations I was in at the time, which was around who has leverage over whom. So the two elements of this that used to come out quite regularly in conversations amongst the international community in Kabul, as well as back in London, was the Taliban needed two things that we had control over. One was money, because we are the major donors, we the donor nations, and the other is legitimacy. I came to the conclusion that neither of those two things was true, and neither of them could possibly be true. So let's take money first. Why do we give? Why do we do humanitarian and development aid? Partly because there's a moral imperative, but partly because if we're thinking seriously, it's in our interests. If you have a state that is failing, or a source of violent extremists, or you have a source of desperate people wishing to migrate, or a drugs economy, or whatever it is, that is a threat to you. And if you're thinking about why you have aid and development programs, it's quite important to engage with the interest side of it as well as the values and the moral imperative side. This was related to me secondhand by a senior international official who was having direct conversations with the Taliban at this time. He said to one of his counterparts, so how are you going to feed people when you're in charge? And the answer was, do you think I will go hungry? And at that point, the penny should be starting to drop, I think. On legitimacy, I think it's much, much simpler than that. The Taliban, why wouldn't they, considered us to be interlopers, they considered us to be invaders, foreign infidel forces, and the government that we had put in place and were propping up to be illegitimate. Of course they think that. So where does legitimacy come from in their view? It comes from conquest and it comes from God. And the fact is they won. So if we're kidding ourselves that we can confer or withhold legitimacy, I really don't see how that works. The final point, though, is now what? And this is, I think, something where there are some very, very difficult policy choices for all governments, including actually the regional governments, Pakistan, Russia, China, Iran, all in slightly different ways. So you've got this group of people in power who nobody recognises as a legitimate government, but they are in power. You have to deal with the facts as they are, rather than the facts as you would like them to be. So we tie ourselves in knots asking, should we recognise the Taliban? In my view, it's the wrong question. These things are currency. You recognise, you give them the seat in the UN when they meet the conditions to do that. In the meantime, you've got a population that is in very, very bad position. We need to avoid losing an entire generation of Afghan girls who are not being educated beyond primary level. As a very wise Afghan woman journalist said to me recently, the problem about not educating girls is you're also not educating boys properly. So just think about where that leads. And we need to find ways through this. In a world where most of the leverage we had, we lost in 2021.
Thank you. Well, following on from fractured and dysfunctional organisations with radical elements, I'd like to talk a little bit about the British government's role in all this. There's been quite a lot of controversy about the role of Britain's senior political leadership at the time. This was not a noted period of political stability. And there have been leaks regarding certain ministers going AWOL or refusing to speak to certain people. And you describe at times being almost dragged into this sort of political blame game. Briefing wars had already started. I wonder how UK domestic politics affected your handling of this crisis.
So it wasn't a particularly edifying time, the purpose of writing the book, wasn't to sort of get in a few blows on all of that. I mean, it's I don't think there's much point in doing that. What I wanted to do, want to do with the book, is to try to explain and describe what happened and why. So in terms of the UK's operation, the evacuation, I think it has two parts. What was happening in London, I think it reflected a number of things. There was a degree of dysfunction, not only in the Foreign Office, but across government as well, some of which is explicable, the scale and pace of onset of the crisis, the fact that it was in August, the fact that, it was still, we're still operating under COVID conditions. There are some parts of it where the people concerned need to account for themselves. It's on them to do that, not on me. The other part is what happened in Kabul. On that, it was extraordinary. So, very, very young soldiers, very young officials, doing things that nobody should reasonably be asked to do. But somehow they did it.
Thank you. This is my penultimate question. I just want to, when you are called upon in the most extreme circumstances to give your view, the sheer sleep deprivation, exhaustion that comes through off the page when reading this, how do you communicate the unfolding nature of a humanitarian crisis, to leaders in London who are probably more transfixed on the political and geopolitical implications? Can you talk me through how you steel yourself to do this?
Yeah. So this is something that, again, I don't think we talk enough about or train people enough, because it's almost something where you can never quite do enough. Actually, the military do this rather better than the civilian ministries. There's a point here about resilience. How do you get yourself, how do you get the people around you through these kinds of extreme situations? So maybe a few things to think about on that. First of all, if you're doing your preparation, this all comes back to culture in an organisation. If you're doing your preparation on that in the moment, you've left it far too late. The culture you're looking for is one where people are realistic about what they're trying to achieve. They know why it matters. They trust the people around them, the people leading them, the people working with them, working alongside them. They also know that if they say, look, actually, I need to leave, the answer will be thank you for what you've done. Also, if they say, actually, we're getting this wrong, they're able to do that. Dealing with ministers, dealing with the seniors back in the UK. The first thing is something I said earlier. It's about telling it as it is, rather than as you wish it to be. A part of that, there are moments in the book where I talk about this, where the relationship with the Americans is fraying. That's putting it politely. Where there are all sorts of things going on in the media. Some of it is holding us to account quite rightly for what's happening. Some of it is just mad stuff. The sort of things that happen in these strange environments. But above all, it's about trying to keep the focus on what actually matters. What do you need to focus on? What do we need to focus on? What's the guidance? What's the steer? What's the input I need from London for us to make this happen? What do I need them to stop doing for us to have a chance of making this happen? And the other, my final point is, since you sort of hint at it, or were too polite to say so, let's talk about the cats and dogs. I'm not going to talk about the cats and dogs. I made a decision very, very early on about day one, that this was not a subject where I am going to discuss the ins and outs of that decision. What I will say on that is that when the very first emails started coming in, the conversation I had with the military leader in Kabul, so Brigadier Dan Blanchford, the guy doing the military side of the evacuation, was this: we are here to evacuate people. We got that, haven't we? We are also here to insulate our people from what is going on around this and other things back in London. That's for them to deal with. This is for us to deal with. That's our job.
Thank you. I was going to talk about gas now. This is my final contribution here. I think, and it's about the kind of legacy and what comes next. The first is, in terms of this debate about the damage that these spectacle and the broader failure has inflicted upon US, UK standing, has this resulted in fundamental change in the international system? I'd be interested to know your thoughts on that. And then regarding our current policy towards Afghanistan, what hope is there of some grand bargain between the Taliban and the international community whereby we trade recognition for their emirates in exchange for them allowing a more inclusive government and ending this awful gender apartheid. What should the UK be doing to this end? Should we have relations? Yeah.
So fortunately, I'm no longer in government. Don't have to answer that question. Comment on it from outside. So what I would do, again, start by recognising what you have rather than what you wish to have. What we have is a Taliban who, when the United Nations put together a roadmap to some kind of normalisation, this was the Federal Siniolu's work, the UN convened a meeting earlier this year. Taliban didn't show up. So if that should be telling us that this is going to be not easy and not quick. So what do you do with that? You break it down into its elements. What are the things that we need? What matters to us? What doesn't matter so much to us? What matters to them? And how do you try over time to align those things? The really key point here is that this is going to be very, very difficult indeed. It's going to take a lot of time. It will probably be quite messy in terms of compromises. Maybe the most important point of all is do not believe you have the luxury of looking away. This problem has not gone away. My prediction would be that we may not have another Al-Qaeda attack against us out of Afghanistan or sort of 9/11 type. But we'd be very unwise to assume that that problem is no longer there. There's a broader context as well, which is what conclusions we draw about ourselves and what others draw about ourselves. So the conclusions we draw about ourselves it's why I found it necessary to write this, and why I think that there needs to be more public debate in the UK, the US, and elsewhere about what we got wrong and why. How was it that 20 years, $2 trillion, thousands of lives, all the rest of it, we're virtually back where we started? How did that happen? Why did it happen? And it is really the world's most expensive learning opportunity if you just let it pass. In terms of others, so I was asked at the beginning of the full-on Russian invasion of Ukraine, was it essentially triggered by the failure in Afghanistan? No, but the failure in Afghanistan certainly didn't help, because what I think that said about us, about the Americans, us, and our other allies, is that we're really not clear what our core interests actually are, and we do not have the will to see them through. I think that the read across to Ukraine is really important there. Ukraine is of fundamental importance to us, meaning the UK, the US, all of Europe. The rules-based international order, describe it any way you want. But I do not find it hard to imagine that we will not have the will to see this through. To understand the nature, the size, the duration of the problem, and that we will somehow think that if we can kind of turn our eye away from this, and somehow it will be less of a problem, or we can give Putin a little bit of what he wants and it will be less of a problem. We really, really need to learn from our errors.
Thank you. I think that concludes this sort of conversational part of the talk. So I think maybe a quick round of applause, for that. We will now open up the floor to questions. I think we'll take them in threes. It's normally conventional. If you want to note them down. My intention was to send a microphone around, but it appears that we only have one working microphone. So I think I'm going to therefore ask those asking questions to project as best they can, and for Laurie to hold the mic. So can I get the first batch of three? I see the first three hands are at the front here, and the gentleman there, and the gentleman at the back. Do you want to start at the front?
Sure. Thanks, Laurie, for your talk. Very interesting, as always. My question is about Russia really, and Taliban. This week you probably heard that Russia was planning, and still is planning, to remove Taliban from the list of terrorist organizations. What do you think are the main drivers for that? Is it some military economic gains, or is it some competition for power in the region with Iran, China, etc.? And I ask a second question quickly. Or only one?
Yeah, go on, shoot.
Okay. The second one, very quick one. You said that Taliban didn't change in terms of values for the last 20 years, but some people think that obviously tactical and operational kind of capabilities changed a lot in the last 20 years, just communications, just of tactical ops, etc. Do you agree with that, and can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Thank you. Okay, so and can you also introduce yourselves, and if you have any affiliation, let us know. Not essential, but yeah.
Hi, thank you, Laurie, for your very insightful talk. It's a pleasure to hear you. My name is Edward. I'm a student in King's, study history. My question was on, I think you briefly alluded to it, on Pakistan. So Pakistan being a kind of non-NATO, one of NATO's non-NATO allies of the UK and the US, but there is like a high Taliban presence, especially in the north of Pakistan. And I just was wondering if you had any insights on kind of the dynamics. How does the fight against, for example, money laundering works? Thank you.
Thank you. And at the back, please, yes. If you could stand up as well and give us your name and any affiliation.
Hi there, my name is Baz. I work in public transport, TfL, so if you're being charged for increased fares, just make sure you touch it. Sorry, just want to say happy to meet you in person. I couldn't put a picture to the face, but I realised Mission Impossible, Solomon came to mind. I had a lot of questions. There was a lot of things spoken about. Whether or not you'll be able to answer all of these, or whether or not I'll be even able to say them on the mic. But if I was to go from top to bottom based on what you've spoken about.
Can we just have one question? One question.
Yeah. So I would say the question would be, that's a difficult one. So I'll just go off the first one. That would be, you mentioned the figure, 15,000 people that you took out of Afghanistan. But bearing in mind, there was quite a lot of people that were left behind, and that figure is technically 5%. And also, bearing in mind the operations that were taking place, I was reading an article, I think it was a whistleblower, that mentioned that, a lot of people that weren't equipped in dealing with the situation, people that, didn't even know the layout of Afghanistan, people that were dealing, say, behind the scenes. Some people claimed that they were working by themselves behind the desk. Empty planes, which I think understand is perfectly acceptable, bearing in mind logistics, but also emails that people are reading. How would you say that impacted, bearing in mind the figure is stated 15,000, but bearing in mind that only represent 5%? How do you feel after this operation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to take those into?
Yeah. So there's a good bunch of questions there, and probably about enough for the rest of the week. Just those ones to go. So Russia and the Taliban. Why? For those of us who've worked in Moscow, I think this is always the sort of the really big question, just trying to get inside the decision making of the Kremlin. My take on it, I don't have any particular insight into this other than having worked in Russia for a long time. Really, two things I think I would bring out. One is that Russia has genuine, obvious, objective interests in Afghanistan, not limited to the legacy of the Soviet intervention, which is a large part of the story, not fully understood, about how we got from there to here, actually. If you think about, for example, what those interests might be, regional stability, obviously. The narcotics trade, obviously, although that's a very, very complex story in the case of Russia and the Central Asia region. Also, this thing about the way that the Russian leadership tends to think about the world, that if there's a vacuum, you step into it one way or another. I suspect that strongly suspect there are rather more geopolitical issues in play here as well, which amount to capitalizing on the US failure, but also the whole thing, I think, that is going on around why Putin decided to launch the invasion of Ukraine, which is essentially changing the rules, changing the terms of power in the modern world, and essentially asserting that Russia has interests and it is going to assert them, whether or not we think that is in our interest or right or lawful or any of that. Taliban and values. So Maybe group a couple of things together here. Communications. I mean, as Jimmy described, it was quite hard to escape the fact in 2021 that the Taliban's strategic communications were awesome. They were, really the best I've ever seen, frankly, in this kind of environment, because they were so simple and so powerful. I described it in my opening remarks, but what it came down to is these people are infidels, these people are their puppets. Lay down your arms, come over to us, we'll give you some money, some food, send you home. If you don't, we will kill you. Actually, we'll probably torture you to death. That's a very, very powerful message, and there was never an effective counter to it. And in the final weeks, I was having discussions with senior members of the government, up to and including the president, about whether it was still possible to turn that round, through some really quick stratcoms interventions. I mean, great in principle, but I think what the facts tell us is far too late. Even if we've been able to do that in the time available. Pakistan as an ally of the West, but this is a massively complex set of problems, and we really haven't got time here to go into all of the partial alignments of interest as they were perceived at the time between the US, the UK. The UK's relationship with Pakistan is immensely complex and historically as well as currently. Just some of the things in play here. Of course, it's the policy of strategic depth. Were the Pakistani government, the military, the ISI ever fully aligned with what we were trying to achieve in Afghanistan? Of course not. There was a game being played out there, as I recounted very, very briefly in the book, we had a UK initiative running in the last period where we were trying to use our military contacts into the Pakistani military side of the government in particular to try to draw them into a dialogue with the Afghan government and with the Taliban to try and achieve that soft landing. My own view on that was it stood not much chance of achieving anything, but there was no particular cost by that stage in giving it a try, as long, again, as we didn't delude ourselves. We didn't tell ourselves that something was happening that was not happening. There are other things in play, the nuclear dimension. This is a country that is, to say the least, unstable, but is also a major nuclear power with one of the world's most dangerous relationships, put it in a neutral way, with India, with China in the mix there as well. And just bringing it back to the counterterrorism thing. I mean, how it felt to me at the time was, if you, meaning the Pakistani government, if you're going to support the Taliban, just be careful what you wish for here. You've got your own Taliban, you've got your own terrorism problem in Pakistan. Think through where this might lead. And I think we're now seeing some of that playing out. Last point on this. Again, it's a point about the law of unintended consequences. So part of the, particularly the US approach to suppressing Al-Qaeda and the Haqqanis, the Taliban and others in Afghanistan was to take that war over the border with the drone strikes program in Pakistan itself. Maybe just worth reflecting a little bit on whether that solved parts of the problem, made the problem worse. Was it a mixture of the two? Where's the balance in there? Finally, the point from the gentleman at the back about the evacuation itself. So I'm not sure whether you'd arrive by the point I was talking about the numbers. Our planning assumption was that we would be lucky to get out a small number of thousands. We'd actually already brought out 2,000 people before Operation Piton even began, as part of the process of relocating people that we badly needed to relocate under the Arab scheme, the resettlement scheme. 15,000 is it's a pretty good number. I think the people involved should be very proud of that. But of course, we left people behind. Nobody was ever going to finish that job. A colleague, even before it started, said to me, again, it's in the book, get ready for that. You will not finish this job. You cannot possibly finish this job. Just understand at the outset that's what's going to happen. The selection process and logistics. So again, a lot has been said about how people were called forward. What were the processes for agreeing categories of people, and all the rest of it. There's a political reality here as well as the scope of the schemes involved. The political reality was that when you're looking at, for example, female judges who've put Taliban and others in jail, they're going to be killed pretty quickly when those people come out of prison. So, an urgent priority was to get them out, or get as many of them out as possible. Journalists, there are people in the room who were involved in trying to get journalists out. That, in my view, was a high priority, and we saw at the time why, we've seen since why. These are people who are going to be high up a list, basically. There were others who, speaking very frankly, their claim was maybe less than the claim of some people that we didn't get out. That's how it goes. There were people who we hadn't fully addressed the question for many years. So, for example, military interpreters, Afghan military who'd worked alongside us. They didn't work directly for us, but they worked on a shared mission, and their lives were and are going to be at extreme risk as a result. If there's a policy failure in there, and I think it is, it's that we hadn't started that process early enough, actually going back years, and thinking through the consequences of what would happen if the worst happened, rather than if what we hoped would happen came about. So what was happening, what that meant, of course, was that you're trying to get people out very, very quickly in very difficult circumstances where it could have been done easier sooner. The two other points, though, that are really important to bear in mind. One is when you're deciding to remove people, particularly in the military or that side of the Afghan government, who the government actually relies on now, that's problematic. And I had a number of conversations, really quite heated ones, in the final few days and weeks with senior members of the government, including the president, where essentially what they were saying to me is, you are evacuating the people we rely on. So that's a very, very difficult decision to make. Last point is there's, I think, a bit of a misunderstanding in the media about how things actually worked. There's this tidy idea that you draw up your list, you populate it with names, you send out emails to those people, and they form an orderly queue out at the front of the Baron Hotel. You saw a bit of what it was really like. What you've got is, every day before joining the Prime Minister's online meetings in London, I would go up onto the walls or out into the street at the Baron or elsewhere, just so I could report back in, what does it feel like? What does it smell like? What you've got is, at the height of that evacuation, maybe miles of people, just people. Those crowds are violent and they're desperate. And if you think that you can simply invite people forward through them, it isn't going to happen that way. There was also a lot of discussion about, well, can we send soldiers out to get them in? Yep, you can do that. And in some cases that was done. But the real decision there for the military commanders and the politicians is, if you send those soldiers out, there is a chance you will never see those soldiers again. Are you ready for that?
Beautiful. Can we get the next three questions, please? Okay, that's one.
I have another one.
Okay, and we've got. Okay, we'll yeah. So we've got, because we've got a third one there. So if we run out of time at the end, I will definitely give you one. But I think the principle that everybody gets one question should be hitting. Slightly muddied by.
My one is a light.
Okay, good.
Very light.
Okay, well, so if you could introduce yourself and state your question.
Hi, I'm Noel from the National Liberal Club's Defence and Security Circle. So maybe a more heavier question than a light question is, does the West, in the last 2 to 3 years, are we facing an inability to shape a global narrative for our own interest? Because I think there is a temptation to feel that the end of the Afghan experience really did weaken our ability to deal with other issues.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Freddie. I just have an interest in Afghanistan. I was listening to a discussion between Sam Harris and Laurie Stewart, where Sam Harris was stating the argument for a kind of more Marshall Plan approach to Afghanistan, where the money that had been spent on the kind of military side of the occupation would have been better spent on more civilian means. Laurie Stewart's view was that literacy rates, lack of centralisation, etc., in Afghanistan would have provided insurmountable burden to that. And I was wondering what your views on that are.
Hi, my name is Mike. Absolutely fascinating, but I found it incredibly depressing. Really, 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 really depressing. And given kind of what's going on when you look around the world at the moment, I mean, it does strike me that the obvious sensible thing is never get involved in any of these messes. So maybe she raise a question, but where do you see the signs of optimism that we can kind of pass through this hopefully current mess and hit some calmer waters? Or is that, am I now being really, I'm not even sure what the word is, do we just have to live with this almost indefinitely?
Wow. How long have we got? Okay, so a couple of really sort of reflections. I think there's a common theme, or set of common themes through all of those questions. So maybe start from the sort of hard geopolitics of this. I think the question is a really, really good one. I frame it slightly differently. And I think there are two dimensions to this that I would really hone in on. One is that the world is changing, objectively changing. Power is changing in the world, economic power, and all the things that follow from that, your ability to exercise hard power, soft power is changing. It's in the words of our Sergei Lavrov, ringing in my ears for many years talking to him. We're now in a multipolar world. We don't like the rhetoric, but actually we are. And I would say actually that's not so bad a thing. It's just a reflection of the changes that have happened, particularly since the end of the Cold War. Our job is to work out what our interests are in that and how we pursue them. But it really does come down to, I think, something I touched on earlier, clarity of purpose and will. And I think, again, whenever I discuss particularly the war against Ukraine here, the clarity of purpose is around us, meaning the UK, the US, and others, the Europeans essentially, understanding that this really is about us. What Putin is trying to do there is to fundamentally change what happened at the end of the Cold War. He doesn't like it. He thinks that it's unjust to Russia. He thinks that we took advantage. I think he's entirely wrong, well, mostly wrong. But nothing we can say or do will change his view on the world. This is about us. It's about Russia's place in the world. And if we miss that, if we misunderstand that and don't understand what that means for us, then we are going to get this wrong. Second point, I've so far managed to avoid the question of this year's elections. But to do this sort of thing seriously, you've got to think across now a generational timescale, which means election timescales in the democracies. So really, really important one coming up in the US this year. A more predictable one, I would say, coming up in the UK in not many weeks. But the underlying principle is the same. What is our national consensus around where our interests lie? What are the opportunities and threats to us? What are the instruments available to us? For the UK in particular, alliances, international law, and so on, where we really need to pay attention to how we achieve those things. Marshall Plan approach to Afghanistan. I covered quite a lot of this already. I think for me, in very, very broad summary, you're not going to achieve anything. You're never going to achieve anything in Afghanistan with violent chaos. So, a baseline level of security needed to be achieved. But the idea that you could solve the political and societal and development problems in Afghanistan by military means, never going to happen. But what that also takes you back to, what's your spectrum of capabilities, with hard military power at one end, development aid, soft power at the other end, and a whole range of things in between. Maybe going back to the previous point, when you're thinking about government policy and future government policy in the US, the UK, and elsewhere, let's think about that spectrum. What are the things we need to achieve our interests, to achieve our values in the modern world? Depression. Let's put it a slightly different way. What did we learn? Non-interventionism. Again, this is playing out right now in the US. I mean, different theatre. But what just happened in the last 6 months in the US Congress? A mixture of things going on, including manoeuvring for really gross political advantage, but underlying that, a sense that this really isn't the US's war. It is. It really is. Until you understand that, if you don't understand it, you will not put the resources, the means into doing that. And the consequence of that 6-month delay is two things: a lot more Ukrainians being killed, and Ukraine's position being fundamentally compromised for what happens at the end of this war. Very brief excursion on that. I do not see that this war ends with outright military victory on either side. I don't think it ends at all for as long as Mr. Putin is in power. But at some stage, there will be some kind of something going on about how do we close this down. And what we need to do before that happens is ensure that Ukraine survives and is in the strongest possible position going into that process when it happens. Liberal interventionism, you didn't use the words, but I will. I think one of the things we should have learned from the last 20 years, particularly Iraq and Afghanistan, is think very, very carefully and clearly before you go into these things. What's your path out? What actually are you trying to achieve? How do you disentangle yourself when public opinion loses the will, as it certainly will, particularly if you don't have that clear path to the exit? Grounds for optimism. I've got to say this. I think there are things, and it's how I chose to end the book. What are some of the other things that happen through all of this? For us in the UK, I think there is a thing here about public service. There's a lot being said about this in the election campaign. I happen to think it's really important. Why do you ask people, military and civilians, to do really tough stuff? You ask them to do it on behalf of the public. And I think, for them to do, for that contract to hold, you've got to think really clean and talk about, so why is it? What does public service mean? Why do we ask our soldiers to go off and do, really dangerous, distressing stuff? Why do we ask diplomats to go to really difficult places? Why do we ask public servants in the UK to do things quite often for not very much pay that honestly, you might rather not do, actually? And this final word about Afghans themselves. So I, when possible, share these events with Afghans, and particularly Afghan women. There are a couple who I got to know quite well, through my brief time there, but also during the evacuation and since. I'll name one of them. I'm sure she won't mind. Zara Joya. I don't know whether you've heard of her, but just Google her. She's now lives in the UK. We evacuated her in August 2021. She set up Rukshana Media. It's a women's news agency to tell the story of women and girls in Afghanistan by women and girls. She's still running it from a flat in London. And what that means is she is still running Afghan female journalists in Afghanistan, with all of the risks that entails. But that's, I think, something to hold on to.
Can I just abuse my position and ask a follow-up question that sort of brings together some of the threads about liberal order, collapse of UK strategic priorities, accepting the world as it is, as the world changes. There is this sort of tendency to see this sort of malaise hanging over Western liberal order, the post-war kind of rules-based system, and connecting the dots between what happened in Kabul to Ukraine and more recently into Gaza. And you mentioned earlier about trying to sort of present what's going on in Ukraine to Americans and say, look, you might not think this matters, that it matters, it does. And the same with Afghanistan, you might have forgotten about Afghanistan hasn't forgotten about you. And but I wonder if the issue is that if you ask that question in South Africa or in India or in the UAE or in Brazil, and you say, is the fundamental rules-based system at stake in Ukraine right now? And they will say no. And I wonder, what do you do about that fundamental? Because a lot of your book is about also sort of stepping inside the position of others, what I think is sometimes called realistic empathy, the ability to see the world through your opponent's eyes. I mean, how do you fundamentally get over that idea that this grand narrative that the West is trying to present is just simply doesn't seem to be accepted?
Yeah. So again, that really needs a book-length answer. Look, we, meaning the West, the liberal democracies, we had it very good in the 1990s. That was the period in which I joined the Foreign Office, and the world looked pretty different then. There was a certain amount of hubris in some of the rhetoric that some of our political leaders used around it. But it was a period where, at least in the former Soviet world, we were there in Romania in the early 1990s. It was pretty chaotic, but it was pretty clear that choices were being made, that we don't want this and we do want this. Looking back on it, Romania, early 1992, if you'd told me at the time that, in my lifetime, Romania would be essentially, with all its imperfections, broadly speaking, a Western liberal democracy, a member of the EU, I'd burst out laughing, but it happened. And I think it does come back to the point we touched on just now about optimism and triumph of the will and all the rest of it, or maybe put it more simply, understanding what you actually want. The other point maybe here is, again, coming back to Sergei Lavrov, I have ringing in my ears. He told me this in these terms many times. The rules-based international order doesn't exist. You people made it up. And as always with effective Kremlin propaganda, there's a grain of truth in there. The rules-based international order, as we, people like me, understand it, and as we did very well from it for at least a decade or more, it has gone. And it's gone for some objectively understandable reasons, one of which is this point that power is shifting in the world, and we are needing to come to terms with a world where actually countries that we need to work with, and we would even in some cases call allies, are not democracies. And even amongst the democracies, there are tendencies towards autocracy and some things playing out there that we wouldn't necessarily wish to see. But maybe my third point on this is I spent large parts of my career working either in or on countries that were not democracies, or in some cases failed or failing states. So this is where I think the confidence thing comes back, your point. If we like living in a democracy with the rule of law and the freedoms and the equalities that entails, we have to argue for it. And we have to win that argument.
Are there any other questions? Yeah, okay, well, we've got one. Yeah, I think you've earned your other question, but if we can take a third.
I've got a third one as well.
Let's see how we go with the first one. But the gentleman at the front first, please.
Me?
Yeah.
I think so. My name is Shah Muhammad Reis, the bookseller of Kabul. When I was a student, there was a joke in our curriculum, in our textbook. I think it was at 6th grade or 7th grade in the school. once Mullah Nasruddin announced that he is able to teach a donkey to sing song. And this news went the ears of King Timurlen actually, and he called Mullah Nasruddin and asked him, how is it possible to teach a donkey to sing song? He said, it's possible, I will do it. But I have three conditions. One is a big bag of gold. The second, a good breed and young donkey. And the third one is 10 years of time for me. And Mullah Timur gave him all three conditions, accepted and gave to him. I'm really sorry, my English is not good.
No, you're fine.
Yeah. And he came with luxury, like limousine to his village. And the people of his village was really surprised and said, oh, we get that much money and that much things with you, gold, the bag of gold with you. He said this was because Timur asked me this thing to teach a donkey to sing song. So the people said Timur is very, very dangerous. He will take off your skin. Is it not possible to teach a donkey to sing song? He said, well, stupid people, I have 10 years of time. In 10 years, either the king Timur will die, or the donkey, or me. Mr. Ambassador, do you think the West deal and contract and agreement with the Taliban is exactly the same with the Mullah Nasruddin?
Right.
Yeah, thank
Okay.
you.
Okay.
Oh, hi there. Sorry, I thought you was going to answer that question. But yeah, sorry. I just wanted to comment in regards to the situation in Afghanistan. I believe you haven't mentioned as much in depth in regards to education, but I think Western media has. But in regards to the situation, I haven't seen it myself. But when the Taliban took over, ideally they're looking at security, they're looking at economy, and they're also looking at education. This is not a question, but a rhetorical question is like, for example, bearing all those things in mind, what use is education if, for example, my stomach is empty? In regards to your honesty, I would like to congratulate you on your honesty in regards to mentioning women are being educated at primary level. But I do believe that's half of the biscuit. I believe the other half of the biscuit should be in regards to women are still being educated in regards to becoming nurses, becoming doctors, working in hospitals, and women can do that. And another question would be, if the Taliban were really against women's education, would they really not, why would they be encouraging women to become teachers to educate their children? And the bonus question, which is the easy question, was, I think there's 3 bottles of Barbara wine. I don't drink wine, but if you were a betting man, the streets of Manchester, I think this is unfair because you've already been to Kabul. The streets of Manchester or the streets of Kabul, which one would you say are cleaner? Thank you.
Okay, I think that's the final round of questions. So we'll ask Laurie to reflect on that, and then we'll have some
I'm going to buy
bubble.
time here for the street cleaning question. Okay, so Mullah Nasruddin and teaching a donkey to sing. So again, I start from the point of a bit of humility here. I mean, one of the to have lived through the 1990s, the post-Cold War period, the height of liberal interventionism, so-called, in particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then through the return of Cold War Mark II. I mean, it's not actually a Cold War and it's not Mark II, but where we are now in terms of great power competition. It kind of invites you to reflect, how on earth did we get from 1989, 1990 to here? It's not what we wanted, it's not what the plan was, but it's what we got. And I think I always come back to this point about, what did we learn? We are in a university after all, so it's quite a good idea to use these spaces to debate this sort of thing. So maybe along the sort of singing donkey, I'll trade you one from the kind of conversations I have with my own students in Cambridge. I've been asked this many times over the years. Should I join the Foreign Office? Should I become a diplomat? My answer is I don't know, because I don't know what you want. Only you can decide what you want, and then there's a conversation about how you get it. Maybe to move that to the second group of questions. I mean, clearly the Taliban themselves do not want Western liberal democracy. I mean, how difficult is that to work out? What do they want? How does it align or not with what we want? And crucially, how does it align with what Afghans want? Not just Talibs and the bits of Afghan society that they draw from. And one of I would say the screamingly obvious governance question in Afghanistan now is that it's not representative of the population as a whole. Whether the structures turn out to be democratic or tribal based, or take your pick, I don't know. But within that, there is a question which I put back to the question back: what do Afghan women want? And is that different from what some Afghan men say they should have? That, I think, is the genie that is out of the bottle in the last 20 years. I know plenty of Afghan women who say, actually, I'm going to make that choice. I'm not going to have someone else make it for me. If nothing else survives from the last 20 years, then that, in my view, will be a pretty good example of what should survive. As for street cleaning, I really hesitate to compare the governance model in Afghan-controlled Kabul. Of course, I haven't been there since the Taliban took it over, and Manchester. What can I usefully say about that? They're different societies, and it does come back to what do you actually want? Is somebody telling you you can't have it? If so, are they entitled to say that? Thank you.
Thank you. Just to wrap up, thank you so much for coming here to speak about your book and your wider experiences today. As I said at the start, it's such an important book, not just as a first-hand account, but in terms of the hard questions you ask, but also it's a very human story, I think, both in terms of the enormity of the choices that you were presented with, and also right down to the enormity of the choices that very junior 19-year-old soldiers were presented with, and the stories of courage, resilience, and just the utterly devastating humanitarian disaster that unfolded. So thank you so much. Thanks for answering all of our questions, and I think a big round of applause for